much, Chairman Royce, Engel, members of this committee, for having me back today to speak about the situation in Ukraine and for your personal investment in that country's future. Let me also take this opportunity to say that we share this committee's sadness and outrage over the murder of freedom fighter and Russian patriot and friend to many of us, Boris Nemtsov. The outpouring of concern from Congress again demonstrates bipartisan U.S. respect for those in Russia and across the region who are working for reform, clean government, justice, and dignity. Today, Ukraine is central to our 25-year effort for a Europe whole, free, and at peace. With your permission, I'd like to focus on three areas in particular today. First, on the hard work that Ukraine is doing with U.S. and international support to build a more democratic, independent, and European country. Second, I'll address both the opportunity that Russia has to implement the February and September Minsk agreements, as well as the further costs that the United States and our European allies will have to impose if Minsk is further violated. And finally, I'll touch very briefly on three other new threats to European security that we are working on: energy vulnerability, corruption, and propaganda, as noted by the chairman, that the Ukraine conflict also brings into high relief, and all we're doing on them. First, a quick reminder of why we are here. 14 months ago, the Kiev Maidan and towns across Ukraine erupted in peaceful protest by ordinary Ukrainians who were fed up with a sleazy, corrupt regime that was bent on cheating its people of their democratic choice for a more European future. They braved frigid temperatures, brutal beatings, and sniper bullets. Ultimately, the leader of that rotten regime fled the country, and then he was voted out by the parliament, including most members of his own party, and then Ukraine began to forge a new nation on its own terms. I want to take a small opportunity here to highlight the very hard work that your counterparts in the new Ukrainian Rada have undertaken just since they were seated in November. The Rada has been a beehive of activity, passing laws to tackle corruption in the public and private sector, to reduce government inefficiency, to strengthen the banking system, to clean up the energy sector, to establish a new police service, to improve the climate for business and attract new investment. It's also been moving forward on political decentralization to give the Ukrainian regions more authority in advance of local elections. These reforms have been politically difficult, but they will also stabilize the economy, and we're seeing the hryvnia start to stabilize even today. And they will also support the swift disbursement of IMF and other international donor support. I can ask you only to imagine what it would have been like if you'd been asked to pass that much legislation that quickly and that painfully. As Ukraine has stood up, the United States and our European allies and partners have stood with her. This past year, the United States provided almost $355 million in foreign assistance to strengthen energy assistance, to aid Ukraine's poorest citizens as gas costs rise, to help fight corruption, to strengthen the Ukrainian border guard and its military, $118 million in security support alone, and to support political reforms, elections, and clean government. And there's more on the way. As Secretary Kerry testified last week, the President's budget includes an FY16 request of $513.5 million, almost 6 times more than our FY14 request, to build on these efforts. Today, we're working with Europe, the Ukrainians, and the IMF to strengthen the country's economy and support the government's reform plan, particularly in implementing this package of legislation, including a new $1 billion U.S. loan guarantee and up to another $1 billion later in 2015 if you and we agree that the conditions warrant and if Ukraine is able to meet its reform targets. This brings me to my second point. Even as Ukraine has begun building a peaceful, democratic, independent nation across 94% of its territory, Crimea and eastern Ukraine have suffered a reign of terror. Today, Crimea remains under illegal annexation, and human rights abuses are the norm, not the exception, for Crimea's most vulnerable populations, especially Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians who won't give up their passports, and for LGBT citizens. In eastern Ukraine, Russia and its separatist puppets have unleashed unspeakable violence and pillage. Hundreds and hundreds of Russian heavy weapons and troops have poured across the border. A commercial airliner was shot down this summer. Donetsk airport was obliterated. Ukrainian pilot Nadia Savchenko languishes in a Moscow jail on day 82 of her hunger strike. And the city of Debaltseve, outside the Minsk ceasefire lines, fell to separatists 6 days after the February 12th Minsk agreement was signed. Overall, as you have said, Mr. Chairman, 1.7 million Ukrainians have been forced out of their homes, and over 6,000 have lost their lives. The United States and the EU have worked in lockstep to impose successive rounds of tough sanctions, including deep sectoral sanctions on Russia and its separatist cronies as the cost for these actions. And those sanctions are biting deeply on the Russian economy. Our unity with Europe with regard to Ukraine remains the cornerstone of our policy towards this crisis and a fundamental element of our strength in standing up to Russian aggression. It's in that spirit that we salute the efforts of German Chancellor Merkel and French President Hollande in Minsk on February 12th to try again with President Poroshenko and President Putin to end the fighting in Ukraine's east. The Minsk package of agreements, September 5th, September 19th, and the February 12th implementing agreement offer the promise of peace, disarmament, political normalization and decentralization in eastern Ukraine, and along with them, the return of Ukraine's state sovereignty and border control in the east. For some in Ukraine, conditions have already begun to improve since February 12th. In parts of the east, the guns have been silenced, and the OSCE has begun to gain access. But the picture is very, very mixed. And just today, we have OSCE reports of new heavy shelling from separatist positions around the Donetsk airport and in the towns outside Mariupol, particularly the strategically important town of Shirokina. And we have reports of a new 17th Russian convoy going over the border from Russia into Ukraine with no opportunity for Ukraine or the ICRC to inspect that convoy. And we all know what they have contained in the past. So in the coming days, here is what we and our international partners have to see. We need to see a complete ceasefire all along the ceasefire line in eastern Ukraine. We have to see full, unfettered access to the whole zone for OSCE monitors. And we have to see a full pullback of all heavy weapons as stipulated in the agreement. If fully implemented, these steps will bring peace to eastern Ukraine for the first time in almost a year. And they will also allow for the implementation of the follow-on steps of Minsk, namely access for Ukraine to its citizens in the east so they can begin a political dialogue, they can begin real work with their own population, and eventually so we can see that international border close. As we have long said, the United States will start to roll back sanctions on Russia when the Minsk agreements are fully implemented, and so will our European partners. But as the President has also said, we will judge Russia by its actions, not its words. And we have already begun this week intensive consultations with our European partners on further sanctions pressure should Russia continue fueling the fire in the east of Ukraine or in other parts of the country, fail to implement Minsk, or grab more land, as we saw in Debaltseve. Finally, just a quick note to remind that traditional military force is only one of the threats to European security that we are working on. There are others, including energy dependence from a single unreliable source, the cancer of corruption, and the Kremlin's pervasive propaganda campaign, where truth is no obstacle. We're working across all those fronts to harden European resilience to these new threats. Just briefly, and there's more in my longer statement, on energy security, project by project, we're working with the EU and key countries to change Europe's energy landscape and to make it more secure, resilient, and diverse. On corruption, we're working with governments, civil society, and the business community, particularly across Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans, to close the space for dirty money to go in and undercut democratic institutions and pervert the business environment. And on Russia's propaganda, we're working with the Broadcast Board of Governors to ramp up efforts to counter lies with truth. We're also requesting more than $20 million in foreign assistance and public diplomacy funds for State Department programs to counter Russian propaganda. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of this committee, America's investment in Ukraine is about far more than protecting the choice of a single democratic European country. It's about protecting the rules-based system across Europe and globally. And it's about saying no to borders changed by force, to big countries intimidating small, and to demanding spheres of influence. It's also, as you said, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, about protecting the promise of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. I thank each of you, and I thank this committee as a whole, for its bipartisan support and commitment to these policies. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.